It's good. Welcome, welcome. Yeah, if you received a personal text from me, that was legit. It wasn't AI. It was legit. If you respond to that bad boy, I'll respond to you back, and that's for real. So glad you're each here tonight. It's glad to have you. If you haven't been here in a while, we missed you. We're gonna get this stuff on the screen, Apple TV on the screen. Here we go. Let me figure out how to get this thing to work. How's everybody doing tonight? Awesome. I'm good. I feel good. I'm excited. All right, is it up there? Sick. According to archaeologists, King Nebuchadnezzar was an actual real-life person. Look at this guy. He reigned during the 6th century, and he was one of the most powerful, longest reigning king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire in the 6th century. If you want to tell your friends that, it's pretty cool. He was known for his elaborate clothes. Check out the guy. But what he was really known was his elaborate architecture, massive building projects, and his mighty army, which destroyed everything that got in its way, including God's people Israel and Jerusalem in 586 BC. This guy was a beast. There was no one on the planet in the 6th century BC that was as mighty as this guy. He reigned and ruled everything, and everyone was terrified of the guy. There was no Pharaoh of Egypt that could compare. There's no other empire on the planet that was as expansive. Nebuchadnezzar's authority was so centralized in Babylon, the capital, that he was considered by all the people in that area of the Middle East a demigod. He was so powerful, he must be like God, or he must be a god, one of the Babylonian gods. The book of Daniel in the Old Testament, found in the Old Testament, chapter 3 records that this bro decides to design a 90-foot or 8-story building size golden statue of himself for all of the Babylonians to worship. And this only confirmed his great power and his godlikeness. Check out this thing. Nebuchadnezzar conquered all of Egypt, the Assyrian Empire before him, all of Israel and many nations, and no one could stop him. And he decides to build this massive 8-story building that looks like him in the middle of a valley. This is not a story the Bible tells. Archaeology shows where this thing stood. 90 feet high in the air. 8-story building. This king builds a statue that looks like him. He's basically saying, I'm the mightiest thing on the planet, and so everyone has to realize that I'm like God. Insane. Nebuchadnezzar conquered, but his genius was really not just with conquesting nations. His genius that he would assimilate conquered nations. You're going, I don't know what that means. Assimilation means this. You bring together different cultures that you've destroyed into one culture with the hope that by creating one deity or one being that everyone worships, that you'll sort of assimilate all these diverse, different religions. Oh, you're the nation that worships Yahweh? Sick. I don't care. You're not going to worship this thing. Oh, you're the nation that worships this Egyptian god over here? I don't care anymore. You're not going to worship this thing. Oh, you're the nation that worships out there where there's modern day Iraq? Doesn't matter anymore. You're worshiping this 90-foot high golden statue. And that was Nebuchadnezzar. There was no one like him on the earth. And what he would do is, instead of leaving leaders and scholars and government officials, this is the Neo-Babylonian Empire. So just check it out. This is where I get really nerdy. This is the Sinai Peninsula right here. Where you're hearing all about Gaza right now is right here. Israel is right here. I've been there. This is modern day Syria up here in the north. This is modern day Iraq that goes out here. Jonah Robson's been in Iraq. He just got back last night. Pretty sick. This is where Jonah was, over here. Modern day Jordan is here, and the Saudi Arabia comes down here in this area. In this whole Middle Eastern, where really they've been fighting for millennia, this is where Neo-Babylonian Empire ruled and where Nebuchadnezzar alone had authority. And so somewhere outside of Babylon, y'all see Babylon? Somewhere outside of Babylon, this area right here, this is the great city of Babylon. You can still go there. Somewhere outside the great city valley, in this valley right here, he built this 90-foot tall statue. And he said, everyone is going to worship this thing because there's no way for me to unify all these nations unless we give them one thing to bow down to. And that bowing down thing you're going to do is me as the king of all this thing. It's pretty crazy. This is a reality. This isn't like, oh, cool, story in the Bible. No, archaeology has discovered in tablets and through history, this guy existed, this thing existed, and this is what he demanded. And he reigned for 100 years. Now, he didn't reign the whole time. He reigned for the longest, but the Babylonian Empire lasted for 100 years, and there was no one that could go against it. In fact, there were times they thought Babylon will be the last thing on the earth. It is the mightiest thing out there. And this bro builds an 8-story statue to himself. So this was the statue that unified them. He commanded everyone in the empire to bow down to it once a day. You imagine? He said, you got to bow down to this thing and you got to worship it once a day. And by doing that, you submit not only to its authority, not only do you submit to Nebuchadnezzar as king, but you recognize that your culture that you left no longer exists. You now have a new culture. And Nebuchadnezzar was brilliant, this historians say, because of assimilation. Because he realized that if he could bring different leaders, different politicians, different government officials from different nations and make them all live in this place in Babylon, if he could make them all live there, they would assimilate into the culture and they would no longer serve their individual gods. They would begin to serve this statue that he created. His hope was that this statue would exist forever, made of gold, and that this people would only expand across the whole globe as Babylon took over everything. Nebuchadnezzar told Babylonians to bow down, worship statue because of this. But here's the problem. Nebuchadnezzar believed, he thought worship was an outward expression that would move the heart of those that sat underneath his authority. And what he didn't realize was that true worship, we know, the Bible says, is that it's actually the opposite. It's inward affection first that will lead to outward response and devotion. Now, why do I share all this? Is because what I want to share tonight and really over the next month as I'm going to sort of teach through different characters in the Old Testament is that Jesus really isn't after your hands lifted. Jesus wants your heart sifted. Now, let me explain. To have your heart sifted means to examine, to see if you authentically mean what you're saying or what you're singing. In other words, it's this question. God is asking, do your inward affections match your outward response? Suppose your outward response, this sort of what we were doing a minute ago, your hands lifted high, you're bowing down, you're singing loudly, you're dancing like a crazy person during the opening song. Does that match your actual inward affections? Or is the reality you're sort of struggling tonight? You're coming in out of the cold, you're kind of going through a dry season, and the reality is you're just trying to fit in with the room. When that's the case, you're performing for God like the Babylonians performed for the king. It's not really the inward affection of your heart. You're just learning in a space like this. This is what it looks like to fit in. And one of the things that we see in this story is God begins to uncover for us some really practical tools when it comes to worship and what God is after in worship. And one of the first things this thing teaches us is that really God is not after this sort of outward expression. Oh, we're all in it. We're going for it. But the reality is he cares about inward. This worship is about outward expression, yes, but more importantly, it's about inward devotion. And what I want to do tonight is I want to look at this story of this statue. And it's actually connected to a story many of you in the room have heard thousands of times. You grew up listening to it about VBS. But I'm hoping that you're going to hear some fresh insights into what worship is and it's not. So I'm going to go ahead and give you the answers to the test at the very top. And here's the 3 things. Here we go. Number 1, we're going to talk about worship is not a performance. We've sort of been tricked into thinking, oh, there's a stage, there's lights, there's music up here. That's what worship is. We even say things like, worship was awesome tonight. What does that mean? I like the songs we sang. But worship is not a performance, and Daniel 3 shows us that. Number 2, worship is devotion to God for who he is. And number 3, if you're writing this down, worship is trusting God in the furnace of trials. The furnace probably gave it away. Let me give some background before we jump in this story. As I said before, King Nebuchadnezzar ruled in the 6th century BC. He was the leader of Babylon, the leading, most powerful empire of the time. conquering both Israel and then taking out the great city of Jerusalem. No other kingdom on earth matched his strength. What'd I say? When Babylon took out Jerusalem, what'd they do? They took the royal leaders, officials, and greatest religious leaders, and they sent them off into exile to Babylon. Why? Assimilation strategy. Their goal was, if I can get them to Babylon, a generation from now, their family will change. They won't serve Yahweh anymore. They'll learn to serve the statue. They'll learn to serve the Babylonian gods. The problem is that Daniel, if you've ever heard the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, the book of Daniel was one of the Jewish government officials. So when you look at that Bible in the Old Testament, you see Daniel, he's one of the Jewish government officials that was exiled to Babylon, okay? He's one of the guys that was sent on the assimilation strategy. He was exiled there with other scholars. And if you read Daniel chapter 1, you learn pretty quickly that Daniel had gifts. And one of those gifts was he could interpret dreams. And he wasn't scared of anyone. So King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, a terrifying dream. He called all of the sort of wisdom people into a room and said, someone interpret my dream, but first you got to tell me what my dream was. And all the scholars are like, oh, I don't know what your dream was. And Daniel, who was a Jewish official, stand in and goes, oh yeah, Yahweh told me what your dream is. Here's your dream and here's your interpretation. He blew Nebuchadnezzar away, the mightiest man in the planet. Daniel blew him away with his wisdom. And so what Nebuchadnezzar did was he looked at this Jewish kid and said, I'm going to make you one of the highest officials in Babylonian Empire. It's pretty cool. This is reality. This is actually true. He trusted Daniel so much that Daniel was allowed to appoint 3 advisors to the king. And those advisors, get ready, were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You've heard that story 1,000 times. But that's the backstory. Daniel was sent on an assimilation strategy to Babylon so that he would stop worshiping Yahweh and start worshiping the statue. And king's like, okay, you're pretty wise. Pick 3 people for me. He goes, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. As I said, to reinforce his rule, unify his empire, Nebuchadnezzar constructed this thing and issued this decree. Every day when the music plays, everyone in the empire bows down. And if you don't, what happens? You die. How? Blazing furnace. You've heard the story. This was the decree that was issued. If you don't bow to that thing, we're sending you to a furnace and you're gone. However, as you know, learned in VBS maybe, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow. As faithful Jews, they served Yahweh alone, obeying the commandment, Exodus 20, you shall have no other gods before me. Exodus 20, verse 3. But their defiance did not go unnoticed. Babylonian astrologers, which were basically the religious people of the Babylonian gods, they were called Babylonian astrologers. They were eager to gain favor with the king, so they reported, hey, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, they're not doing it. Every day when the music plays, they're not bowing down. In fact, they seem to be worshiping some other god. It didn't make sense. The king had specifically created a strategy that every leader would come to Babylon and worship this thing. And so he knew what he needed to do. We're going to jump right into scripture. Daniel chapter 3, verse 12. It's on the screen. But there are some Jews whom you have set. This is the astrologer saying this to the king. There's some Jews who you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. I like the color green way better. Who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of the gold that you've set up. It's a problem. Verse 13, furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. Come on, you got to answer to the king. And Nebuchadnezzar says, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold, that statue I showed you, I've set up? Is it true? You guys aren't bowing down to this thing when the music plays. Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, if you want to know what zither is, I have it up here. That's apparently a zither right there. I don't know, I've never heard of it. The zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music. If you're ready to fall and worship the image I made, perfect. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then, this is crazy, then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? I'm the greatest king that's ever existed. I'm a demigod. The first thing we learn from this passage is that worship is not performance. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were the ultimate rebels. Because when Nebuchadnezzar issued his decree, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow. They would not perform. They understood that worship was not about allegiance, that worship was allegiance to Yahweh, not outward compliance to a false god, to a king that actually wasn't God. They still were so devoted to Yahweh, they were willing to waste all of it. And many people that read this story ask themselves, why didn't they go through the motions? Would God really have cared if they just bowed down to the stupid 8-story piece of gold? Would God really have cared? But these men knew, and the Bible seems to illustrate for us, that outward actions must align with inward devotion, and to pretend otherwise would be dishonoring to Yahweh. And these men were willing, already in high positions within the government, in a government they never asked to be a part of, but that God in his favor brought them there. Their convictions teaches us something vital tonight. That worship is not just what we do with our external responses. It's about what happens inside of our heart. Authentic worship is about encountering God authentically. God desires sincerity over spectacle. He desires our heart over our performance. Worship is not performing for God. God's not looking down tonight at shift going, are they lifting their hands? Are they singing loud? Are they dancing during the first song? Are they bowing down at the end? No, worship to God matters more about the heart. It's about does God see the heart of trusting him? See, worship is not what happens in a room. Worship is what happens in a heart. It always has been. It has to begin there. True worship means aligning your inward devotion to God with your outward affections for him. Let me say that again. True worship is aligning the inward affections of your heart. It starts here. I have to know God is great before I respond outwardly that he's great. See, Nebuchadnezzar assumed that if he could get people to outwardly express worship, that their inward heart would change. That's not the reality. Worship always begins at the root of the heart. It always begins with what's inside here. And what God's desire has always been and shows in this picture was that for them, they weren't willing to give an expression that wasn't real. They wanted the inward devotion of their heart to Yahweh to match, and so they refused to give their outward expression to anything that was false. Worship is not a performance. It's your heart before God. He does not want you to lift your hands. He wants you to lift your heart first. That's important. Worship is a lot more about the sacrifice of your life than it'll ever be about a room like this with your hands lifted. Worship is your heart. It's not a performance. Number 2, worship is devotion to God for who he is. Let's follow the story. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, these guys were freaks. We do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. This is the most powerful man on the planet. And we're like, no, we don't really need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. This is what they say, verse 17. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve can deliver us from it. And he will deliver us from it. This is brave. King, listen, we don't really need to talk to you about this. If you're going to throw us in the furnace, go ahead. The God we serve can just deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from it, from your majesty's hand. And then they say the craziest thing, I think, written in the book of Daniel. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship this image of gold that you have set up. Worship is devotion to God for who he is. Did you catch that? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood before the king with unwavering faith. Their response was not conditional on what God would do for them, that God would deliver them. Their conditional worship came out of their desire of who God was and who God is. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, surely God can deliver us, but if he doesn't, we will not serve you. This is worship at its core. They believed God could save them. They declared that God would save them. But if he didn't, they still trusted in his goodness. That's crazy. True worship is not about what God does for you, but who he is. These three men did not love God because he might save them. They loved him regardless of the outcome. They knew God was going to deliver them. It would either be from the fire or through the fire. Sometimes God rescues us from fire. He removes trials that are right in front of you. He answers prayers that you've been praying. He brings you immediate relief. God, please help me in this area. But oftentimes God rescues us through fire, not from. What does that mean? It means that God walks with us in our suffering. It means that God walks with us in our disappointment. It means that God is strengthening our faith through it. We worship God because God has delivered us from every struggle we've ever faced. No. We worship God because those that worship God don't have any sort of trouble. No. In the moment we begin to attach God deserving worship when he saves us, is the moment you and I run into a problem. Because you and I are facing trials every day. You and I are walking in answers God hasn't answered yet. You and I are wrestling through different trials in our life, asking the question, is God still worth it? And these three say, yes. God can deliver us. God will deliver us. But if he doesn't, he's still God. And I'm still stepping into the furnace. I do not care if he delivers me from the fire or through the fire, or if he delivers me when I'm dead. It doesn't matter, because God's still good, and I will not worship you, King. That's worship. It's not, well, I'm going to worship God because God's been so kind to me lately, and he's answered every prayer I want, so he's worthy. No, it's God's worthy of worship, starting with inward affection, moving to outward expression. And I'm going to worship him with everything that I can. And the beauty of Daniel 3, don't miss this. The beauty of Daniel 3 is that he's inviting a people who will worship God in trial, not after trial. He's inviting a people that will worship God in fire, not after fire. He's inviting a people to worship God in struggle, not after struggle. They're saying God is worthy of devotion for God, for who God is, not for what God does. Worship is not a transaction. I'll worship you if you give me this. You're deserving if you answer this. No, Yahweh's worthy. Jesus is worthy. Worship is not a transaction. It is our declaration of trust in the midst of a trial. Worship is not a transaction. It's a declaration of trust in the midst of a trial. This is your opportunity to trust him in the midst of a trial. Which leads to the third point tonight. Worship is trusting God in the fire of trials. Let's finish the story. I mean, can you imagine? Listen, your majesty, no offense. Go ahead and throw us in there, because if you do, he'll deliver us. Actually, he can deliver. Actually, if he doesn't, it doesn't matter, because we're going to serve him way before we serve you. That's crazy, but that's worship. So what does Nebuchadnezzar do? Nebuchadnezzar was furious, with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. His attitude toward them changed, which means he got madder than he's ever gotten mad before. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than normal. That means he was 7 times as mad as he normally is. He commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Just tie them up, grab a rope, put them all in, and just toss them in, and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men wearing robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers. That's crazy. So buying these three men, I'm walking them to the furnace. They're walking towards the furnace. The guy's walking to the furnace, burn up. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego just go ahead in. And these three men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. You're like, it's over. Last verses. King Nebuchadnezzar leapt in amazement and asked his advisors, wait, weren't there three men that we tied up and threw into the fire? Wait, I thought we just threw three. They replied, certainly, Your Majesty. There's just three guys in there. He goes, look, I see four. Wait a second. We put three guys in. Three guys that turned their back against the one thing we asked them to do, which was bow down to this 90-foot thing. We're trying to humiliate, kill, destroy any sort of people that might ever revolt or rebel. Throw all three of them in. And when I look at the three of them in there, they're not burning. In fact, there seems to be a fourth one there. See, I see four men walking around the fire. They're unbound. Whatever was tied, no longer. The rope's the only thing that burned. And unharmed. And the fourth looks like a son of God. We know this was a theophany. Theophany was a visible form of God. This was the pre-incarnate Jesus. Jesus shows up in the Old Testament out of nowhere. He is the fourth man in the fire. What is this teaching us? What a story. One of the craziest theophany, presence of God sort of story in the Old Testament. What is it teaching us about worship? I believe a couple of things. In the scriptures, fire always symbolizes two things. It symbolizes God's presence. Think Moses in the burning bush. The cloud on fire that goes before the Israelites as they head into the desert to the promised land. And it represents trials. Trials. 1 Peter says, don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on to test you. John 16, Jesus says, in this world you'll have trouble, but take heart. I've overcome the world. James 1 says, consider it pure joy, brothers, when you face trials of many kinds. See, many of us view trials as these sort of isolated events in our lives when everything goes really, really bad. It's like this big disruption. It's like parents go through divorce, loss of a grandparent, loss of some sort of close friend, flunking, or like some sort of major thing that sort of moves. No, the reality is that every one of us in the room are facing a trial right now. See, trials are these physical trials. You're ill. Someone you love is ill. You're injured from a sport. That's a trial. Emotional trials. You're anxious. You're depressed. You've been in grief and you don't know why. You're disappointed. That's an emotional trial. Betrayal. Conflict within your home. Family struggles with your parents. That's a relational trial. Job loss. Parents struggling with debt. Don't know how you're going to pay for college. Maybe even poverty. It's a financial trial. Doubt. Dry season. Temptation. Same addiction. That habit you can't get rid of. That's a spiritual trial. Struggle with calling, purpose. Who am I? Do I matter? Did God really create me? Do I have any self-worth? Do I like who I see in the mirror? Do I have any direction for my life? What am I supposed to do? Who am I? That's an identity trial. See, the reality is that everyone in the room has a trial right now. There's no one that's a human being that escapes the furnace. There's none of us that escape the ability to go through something difficult. The question I have for you tonight is, how many are you willing to worship God in the midst of the furnace? How many of you are willing to trust God through the furnace? See, God's promise is not instant escape for you. It's instant presence in the midst of it. He's not looking down going, does anybody want to be rescued from their trial? Oh, you don't? Oh, you do? Okay, great. Oh, let me figure it. No, he's going, who's willing to trust me in the midst of it? Who's willing to still lean in and worship me in the midst of it? Who's able to put this type of faith that we see? Because what we see with the fourth man in the furnace is that Jesus tends to be very willing to walk with us in the midst of our trial, not simply deliver us from it. Jesus seems to be willing to sit with you in the middle of the heat. Jesus seems to go, I know this isn't answered yet, and you're struggling, and you're wondering where I am, but you have to believe this, child. I'm the fourth man in your fire. I'm with you in the middle of your trial. I'm going to sound like a dad here, and I get it. But the reality is that trials, furnaces, fire, at the end of the day, they refine you. Fires, as you get older, hard seasons, and listen, I could ask any adult in the back. This is a reality. I wish it wasn't the truth. For you to develop real empathy requires you to go through suffering. For you to actually become wise requires you to go through seasons that are hard. For you to experience love that doesn't make sense requires you to experience loss that doesn't not hurt. See, empathy, wisdom, perseverance, character, integrity are not built in comfort. They never have been. They're built in trial. This is why Paul leans in and says, consider it pure joy when you face trial, because you're growing in perseverance. Consider it great joy when you face trial, because you're growing in integrity. Consider it great joy, Paul writes, from prison. Why? Because he knows Jesus greater in the furnace than he ever knew Jesus outside of it. See, we grow in our relationship with Jesus in the furnace. Human nature is like, I just want to be free and like pain-free and comfortable, and everything happens and everything is great. If that happens, you're going to build a statue. But if you experience trial and furnace and suffering and parents that are going through divorce and friendships that are falling apart, and you're calling and you didn't make the team, and your sister's mad and your boyfriend broke up with you and your grandfather's struggling, then it's in those moments that Jesus becomes real, because he becomes available, because he becomes there in the furnace. I know you're afraid of trials. I know you want God to deliver you from everything that hurts, but hear me, he's known in them. He becomes loved in them. He becomes recognized in them because he's what you need. When you're given everything you want, you don't need him. But trials are a gift. This is what made these three men say, God can deliver us. God will deliver us. But if he doesn't, he's going to use this. Just watch. They had no idea a fourth man would show up in that fire. They had no idea. But Jesus invites you, in whatever your trial facing tonight, to trust him. This is you. This fire could be anything tonight. You're just walking in. I didn't want to come to shift tonight. I'm angry at God because. I'm frustrated with God because. I don't know if God's real because. That's your fire. My question is, are you willing to believe he's right there in the middle of it with you? And the deeper question that breaks my heart is, are you willing to sit in it without him? He wants to be with you right in the middle of it. He wants to say, I'm real. I'm right there in the midst of it. All right, here's what we're doing tonight. Let me give you a summary of what we talked about. Worship is not a performance. We must make sure our outward affections match our inward affections. Don't come into this place and just start to worship if your heart's not there. Let your inward affections lead to your outward. And some of you need to start letting your outward affections go for it. Stop being embarrassed. Lift your hands if your heart's ready. Get low if your heart's ready. The Psalms are filled with outward affections stemming from inward, but it's not a performance. It's your heart with God. Number 2, worship is devotion to God for who he is. We worship not because of what he does for us. We worship because he's God, and that's enough. We trust in his power and his goodness and submit our whole lives to him. That's faith in its purest. And lastly, worship is trusting God in the fire of our trials. The 3 men were not delivered from the fire, but instead met God in it. You might not be delivered from your fire, but you will meet God in it. If you're available, if you're ready, if you need him. One of the things that we've been trying to do is shift. We've got a lot of new people tonight. We've been trying to sort of gather in small groups and have a conversation. Now, some people come and go, that's really awkward because no one's going to pick me. I don't know anybody. I don't want to do that. So there's 2 options tonight. If you're in a place, Nate Dogg, come on up, play some music. If you're in a place tonight where you're going to gather in a small group because you're ready to sort of talk about this, then I want to do that. And here's your one question tonight. The 3 men were not delivered from the fire, but instead met God in it. What does this teach us about God's presence in our trials? Don't look at that word. No, don't look at that word, whatever it is. All right. What does this teach us about God's presence in our trials? I'm going to give you an opportunity, if you'd like to, in small groups, to just have a quick conversation about what does this teach us about God's presence in trials. You might even find in your small group tonight, you just want to say, here's a trial I'm going through. Will you guys pray for me? Okay? Now, if you're here tonight for the first time, you're like, that seems intimidating. I'm going to give you a second option. You can sit where you're at and still in this moment, come before God, find a place in the room, and just say, God, here's the trial I'm going through. I need to know you're in the middle of this with me. And I'll give you another last thing as we head into 15 minutes of worship. If you're in a place tonight where you'd like a leader to pray for you, what I want to do for the next month is I just want us to just agree this front area will become an altar. And if you happen to cross this line to the front, we're not going to be like, oh, what's your heart? Tell your whole story. Here's clean. No, we're not going to say a word to you. We're just going to pray for you. So you have 3 options. Gather in a small group, answer this question, share a trial. Option number 2, stay seated, don't move, close your eyes, just spend some time with Jesus and talk to him about whatever trial. Trust me, every one of you is going through trial. Number 3, during this last part of worship, if you'd like some ministry time for some of us leaders to pray over you, be brave. You can come forward. If you come anywhere in this front altar, we'll pray for you specifically, and then you can go on. We've got about 15 minutes of worship. Sound good? Everybody know the 3 options? All right, let's pray. Jesus, we just want to say thank you for being a God who walks with us in trial. We want to thank you, God, for all that you do and your kindness. Now be with us, whether we meet in small group, sit, pray, or come forward for prayer. In Jesus' name, amen.